Editor Sif here. It was my intention just to directly upload the talk that I did on September 3rd, but my lapel mic decided to be a bit annoying and not pick up, well, most of the talk, so I'm having to re-record quite a massive chunk of it for your listening joy. Anyway, so sit back, relax. This is me talking about the Valkyries for about 30 minutes or so, and just generally nerding out, so yay! Hello, my name is Sif. I am a digital artist and a Norse heathen. My particular area of interest lies in death and burial in pre-Christian Germanic cultures alongside the ever-mysterious magical practice of Seithr. Now, I have tried to condense this talk down to a tidy 30 minutes or so, but we'll see how we do. I am known to talk at length about all of this: Valkyries, Freya, hell, burial rites, death, Seithr, resurrection, fate threads, etc., you name it. So why am I so focused on the Valkyries? Well, I think a part of that will hopefully be answered by the talk I'm giving here today. Full disclosure, I also worship the Valkyries alongside Hel, Freya, Sif, Skarthi, and Air, who form the crux of my praxis. More than anything, I feel that they are so often overlooked. At some point, many heathens and heathen academics collectively agreed that we understood the maidens of slaughter to a T, and pocketed them away in a folder labelled something like done and dusted. And I absolutely understand the drive to do that. After all, there's a joke in online heathen spaces about the nature of heathen discourse. A, you're doing it wrong, and B, you can't tell me what to do. We love to talk and theorize and discuss and tear things apart and research and so on. There's so little that we do completely and holistically know, and most of our efforts are dedicated to piecing together the smallest of shards to try and frame a larger image. So we had pieced together the Valkyries into what we thought was a whole and filed them away. We had decided that they were simply the Nordic and Western Germanic psychopomps, bridging the gap between the world of the gods and our own mortal world. But I think there's more to uncover, more to learn, more to discover, with connections that span across the entirety of the known lore. I'm giving this talk about roughly a week after doing an online bloat for the Valkyries for national and international attendees, which was an incredible experience and I think opened some eyes. For some, that was their first ritual. They didn't really know what to expect. Other more seasoned pagans told me that it changed their perspective. I'm hoping to change your perspective potentially here today, perhaps. Maybe. We'll see. So, imagine a Valkyrie. What do you see? Do you see a sort of angel of death, wielding a spear, flying over the battlefield? Some Wagner-esque bronze breastplates with swirly bits, hair in plaits, horned helmet. In the lore, they are dignified cupbearers in Valhalla. They are women in shining armour on horseback. They are also bloodthirsty, battle-lusted monsters who gleefully twist and pull men's intestines on the field of war. The Valkyries, or Valkyria to use the Old Norse, are all of these descriptions seemingly at once, appearing here and there in the myths and sagas as agents of Odin. Their roster, for lack of a better word, changes frequently. Neil Price quotes 52 named Valkyries in the Viking Way, while other academics say between 48 to 52, depending on their interpretation of reincarnation in the sagas, seeing as a few of these figures have a tendency to simply reincarnate into the next generation of Valkyries, as well as their opinion on whether certain Valkyries are actually Freya under another name, but that's interesting for another reason I will touch upon later. But regardless, mystery and intrigue surrounds them. And yet the haunting image of the winged warrior woman persists even today, prevalent in the collective zeitgeist. But who were they? What knowledge have we potentially lost over the last millennia? We can only guess, and, in what is an ongoing effort for heathens, piece together the scattered pieces. So with that in mind, I come to the centre of this talk. I am disheartened by the all-too-common narrative that the Valkyries are, and were, servants, almost mindless drones of Odin who carry out his will. There are numerous academics and heathens alike that almost fall into the trap of this perspective, making Odin into a sort of omnigod meting out his will and whim through his hordes of winged warriors on the battlefield. They are often described by modern writers as beings without personality or agency of any kind, and it's by no means an accurate statement if one were to read the myths and sagas. H.R. Ellis Davidson calls them battle goddesses in her work Myths and Symbols in Pagan Europe. They're worthy of reverence in their own right, and that's basically where I stand. But let's break all of this down and go back to past me, say 4 or 5 years ago. Back to one persistent, nagging question. The first of many. It's a question that settled firmly in the back of my mind and refused to leave. It's a question that seemed completely at odds with this image of the Valkyries I've described, an image entirely summarised by the idea of them being solely Odin's servants. The question is this. If the Valkyries are Odin's servants, why does Freyja get half of the chosen dead? This is stated in Grimnismal verse 14, the sayings of Grimnir, of the Poetic Edda. So use the Bellows translation. The 9th is Folkvang, where Freyja decrees who shall have seats in the hall. The half of the dead each day does she choose, and half does Othin have. Snorri Sturluson, damn you Snorri, echoes this in the Prose Edda during the beguiling of Gylfi. But Freyja is the most renowned of the goddesses. She has in heaven the dwelling called Folkvanger, and wheresoever she rides to the strife, she has one half for the kill, and Odin half. Now, there are ways of interpreting this, and many have, as Freyja getting first pick of the chosen dead delivered by the Valkyries. First pick of the Valkyrie chosen, or indeed any percentage of the chosen dead, sort of flies in the face of the prevalent idea of these beings being servants to Odin and Odin alone. Now, it's also worth pointing out that the goddesses in the Eddas play very in-the-back sort of roles. There's a bias here that comes from the time it was written, and it would be easy to imagine that details were omitted, on top of the natural filtration and dilution due to time, the nature of the oral tradition, and memory. If you do happen to listen to the podcast, then you know we give Snorri a lot of strife, salt, opposition, blame. Most of it, let's say 90%, is tongue-in-cheek, and I give credit where credit is due here, as I'm glad he wrote this down. And I'm glad he included this line in his work, because the fact that he included it at all gives insight into potentially greater image. That is to say, if this was recorded even with the bias, what wasn't mentioned? What else could there have been in terms of common knowledge and Freyja's connection to the Valkyries and the dead? So we have here an established connection to Freyja and death and battle, but we also have an intriguing breadcrumb to pursue, because despite their relative absence, it is interesting to note that goddesses are often tied very closely to death, or the veil between life and death. Freyja, Air, Ran, Hel, Gulveig, and the Valkyries all play a role in this consideration, and in reference to the aforementioned with the relative scarcity of goddesses in the lore, this association is brought into greater focus. In Valkyrie, Women of the Viking World, Joanna Friedrichsdottir states that the Disir, here female spirits and minor goddesses, appear to give and withhold life, protection, and prosperity. They are guardians and takers of life. This certainly brings to mind the Valkyries themselves, who are often described here and there as Disir, even if modern academia has worked to further demarcate the Disir from the Valkyries in the last couple of decades. Time and time again, then, we see a connection to goddesses and the control, or the very least, a heavy influence over life and death. So where do the Valkyries sit in all of this? What is Freyja's connection to the Valkyries? Well, one commonly stated theory is that Freyja is the queen of the Valkyries, or otherwise head honcho. It's a view held by Jackson Crawford, among other academics, and it is a thought you generally see stated as fact in a plethora of sourcebooks. Indeed, the recent God of War game depicted Freyja as the previous queen of the Valkyries, with the current queen being Sigrun, and to be honest, I really did quite enjoy this as an interpretation. Now, don't get me wrong, I would love if we had something solid here in terms of evidence, rather than the, in my opinion, rather weak connective tissue of Freyja being a goddess, and generally seen as higher in the godly hierarchy than the Valkyries, and her associations with battle and getting half the dead. That's basically it in terms of evidence. Interestingly, though, I've seen quite a few Freyja devotees kick back at this idea of Freyja being the queen of the Valkyries. Patricia LaFile, a noted heathen in regards to this topic in her book Freyja Lady Vanadis, essentially writes that describing Freyja as a Valkyrie or anything similar reduces her power, For, and quote, "We know that Freya was a very important goddess in her own right. The Valkyries were Odin's servants. They served the warriors who entered Valhalla mead and meat all night long. Therefore, it stands to reason that Freya, certainly never mentioned as a servant to any other deity, would not be a Valkyrie. Her rank, high among the gods of the Norse, assures this." And that seems to be a common perspective, in having to lower Freya to the Valkyries' level to allow the association to work. I think in many ways this narrative has hindered any sort of reconsideration of the Valkyries and their role in the lore. I posit that we should work instead to elevate the Valkyries from the image of servant, and more, and this is the foundation of the talk, to crucial deciders of fate. So before I move on, I would feel it would be appropriate to mention that there are so many differing opinions when it comes to Freya and her connection to the Valkyries. We have the Lefile idea that lowering Freya to the level of the Valkyries does her a disservice as a prominent goddess in her own right. We also have those like Maria Kvilhaug, who in her book The Seeds of Yggdrasil, which is an absolute beast, might I add, believes Gondul and Hilda are Freya, alongside the mysterious Gullveig we mentioned earlier, and will mention again in a moment. But we don't have anything more than conjecture, so here's me adding my hat into the ring. And of course it goes without saying that I have the greatest of respect for those that have already written extensively on the topic. I believe fundamentally that by analysing the relationship between the Valkyries and Freya, we can potentially and apprehensively start to fill in some of the holes in the lore that heathens have pondered for decades, namely the machinations behind the Great War between the Aesir and Vanir, and the deal struck between the two tribes of gods. As you might have already guessed, I stand very much on the side of, despite the centuries of academic discourse, we haven't touched the surface of the Eddas. There are things we've accepted as fact or common knowledge that I feel we should reevaluate. The Valkyries naturally included here. So why were hostages exchanged after the Great War? Why were seemingly the most prominent of the Vanir gods selected to live among the Aesir? Why was Freya among them, for only two Aesir gods were sent to the Vanir, Heinir and Mimir? In my belief, the answer to that lies in the Vanir's mastery of Seithr. For one potential use of Seithr that particularly piques my interest is its use as a tool for resurrection. It is here that things become more interesting, the connective threads coming alive with possibility. We know, as far as the core sources inform us, that the Vanir had Seithr workers among their ranks, with Freya being the most prominent among them. If Seithr does indeed involve some sort of resurrection element, it would be easy to see how a war between the two tribes of gods could reach a stalemate. The latter's talents for warfare perhaps found themselves against an undying Vanir army, indeed if gods can truly die in a way that mortals can, with their dead coming back after the day's battle. I wanted to put forth an academic that said a similar idea, and indeed it seems that Ursula Dronke did exactly that in her works around the Great War. Now, endless battle against resurrected forces may seem like quite a familiar premise in the Nordic Eddas, and potentially maybe we see a seed planted here, a seed that would eventually sprout into Valhalla. Once again, I found myself beaten to the punch on that by an academic, as a similar comparison was raised by Richard North in 1997. Damn it, I was born too late. Perhaps Odin, with the thought of Ragnarok or another calamitous event very much present in his mind, from the Cirrus's prophecy in the Vluspa, saw potential in this resurrection magic. He remembered Gullveig, she who died and was given life again 3 times. He saw it as a potent tool. This might explain Odin's actions that followed the Great War between the Aesir and Vanir. A truce, an exchange of hostages followed to reinforce the renewed peace, with Odin seeking Freya's Seithr work, which was impressive even among the incredible talents of the other Vanir. What is interesting is that the excerpts of the Poetic Edda and Heimskringla that mention the hostage exchange lend ambiguity to the whole affair. As I've touched on, 3 Vanir gods end up in Asgard, in exchange for 2 Aesir. It wouldn't be a jump to say that Freya was simply invited to join her brother and father, and looking at the alternative of a home without them, accepted. This sets up her arrival in Asgard on an altogether more favourable foot, not as some peacemaking device, but more akin to an invited guest. Again, there's very much the feeling in the literature that explanations have been washed away with time. The lines connecting Gullveig, Freya, the nature of the exchange, Odin, and Seithr made incoherent. But connections there are, tentative though they may be now a millennia later. Nonetheless, courtesy of Snorri and the Heimskringla, we have evidence that Odin and the Aesir learn Seithr through Freyja. I think I would be remiss here to ignore the similarities between Freyja and Odin, as gods associated strongly with lust and battle and magic. Both can be associated with frenzy, with ecstatic states, and like Odin, Freyja travels and wanders and has many names. I think it's no coincidence then that these are the two gods tied so innately to the Valkyries, for I believe it is Seithr that offers a plausible explanation of the connection between Freyja, Odin, and the Valkyries. For a bargain was apparently struck between the two gods, a bargain that would eventually lead to Freyja receiving half of the Valkyries' yield. Perhaps Odin offers Freyja half of the chosen dead for a whole Sasrumnia in exchange for teaching him Seithr, that coveted tool he saw the Vanir utilize in numerous ways during the war. He is a seeker of knowledge after all, so how fantastic a prize does something like Seithr seem to him? Moreover, Odin wants an undying army to fight against the perceived inevitability of Ragnarok, or a threat equal in its destructive power, if we're to dismiss the event as Christian scholars exaggerating the death of the gods. He wants the very best and most capable of Midgard's warriors at his side when the time comes to fight for Asgard's very survival. Perhaps then Freyja teaches those that become the Valkyries Seithr in turn, thereby connecting her to them. This not only establishes a connection between Freyja and the Valkyries, but also explains why the Valkyries are apparently all women, Seithr being seen as particularly feminine. While I don't hold much weight in Freyja being given the title of Queen of the Valkyries, I do see her as the archetype on which the Valkyries were created, the mould on which they were forged. So why do I believe Seithr to be crucial in the Valkyries' creation? Well, I'm very much of the opinion that historical Seithr is a tool for the manipulation of fate. The topic of fate in Nordic literature is certainly a difficult one to get your head around, and indeed there's often the temptation to lean on, say, the Hellenic interpretation of a fate thread, which is altogether more tidy for lack of a better term. So for anyone interested in a quick breakdown of the multi-part soul, I urge you to watch the video on the Heathen Weirdos YouTube channel entitled The Multi-Part Soul. Essentially, we can gather that fate and the Norse beliefs around the soul are intricately entwined through a combination of Urda, or weird, to use the Anglo-Saxon equivalent, and the concept of Orlog potentially manifesting most strongly through the Hamingar. Further, there's also evidence for a very strong connection between the multi-part soul and Seithr as a practice, namely in sort of micromanaging the individual elements to converse with the dead, the hugger or mind of those that have passed, or otherwise travel to places the hammer, the skin, cannot go, and so on. Before I get lost in the mud, just pocket that the idea of the soul and Seithr, in my belief, go hand in hand. In the lore that we do have, Seithr frequently appears to involve protection, divination, resurrection, and by extension, manipulation of an ever-shifting weird. After all, if Odin wants only the chosen slain to be a part of his army in Valhalla, the manipulation in the battlefield seems a given, and Odin himself is no stranger to altering fate, to pull on threads here and there to manipulate events in his favour. We see this with Sigurd, who has his powerful sword Gram broken by Odin during his battle with King Lyngvi. The best warriors, after all, are the least likely to die in battle, and that can't be the case if Odin wants his army. More to the point, if Seithr does involve the manipulation of weird and that it alters potential and possibility, then we get another aspect to the battle maidens in their roles as choosers of the slain, as healers, protectors, and guardians. I will preface this by saying that dual roles are not uncommon in the lore that we have. We see the Valkyries themselves, bloodthirsty though they are on the battlefield, become cup-bearers in Odin's hall. Freyja, she of love and beauty and passion, a powerful Seithr worker, is also associated strongly with war and death, as we've talked about. Handmaiden to Frigg, protector and healer, could be one and the same as the Valkyrie, known as If Seithr does involve manipulation of fate on the battlefield, with the Valkyries choosing who gets taken to Valhalla or Sesromnia, then they may also choose who does not die, who lives to fight another day. In her role as a Valkyrie, may carry on her healing duties akin to a field medic. This fits. If the Valkyries were to intervene in fate, then healing someone to avoid needless death completes the image. They deliver death and spare life equally in their realm, the blood-spattered fields of battle. The clatter of swords is their chorus, the roar of desperate men their choir. Forgive me, I get a bit carried away with the Valkyries. Moving on. This manipulation allows them to alter the battle to ensure those chosen actually perish, making shields fail or guiding an arrow to its mark. We see sources evoke the image of Sather on numerous occasions, but most notably in Jarl's saga, with men's entrails being the warp and weft, and Volung Darkvither, where the Valkyrie spin flax. Gondul, who makes an appearance in the Heimskringla, Jarl's saga, and the Vluspa, among others, is a figure of particular interest here, and a being who interests me personally. Her name is often translated as wand wielder or staff bearer, derived from the Ganda, a staff that is strongly associated with Sather. Rudolf Simic also posits that the Valkyrie Svipul's name refers to the changeable nature of fate. So if the Valkyries are the masters of the battlefield, choosing who lives and who dies, then does this not grant them extraordinary power in the time of the Vikings, and indeed throughout time? After all, few events can make and break empires more than the crucible of battle. Kings die, kingdoms fall, thousands of families impacted. Fates are changed dramatically and drastically across vast regions. War shapes those regions, and the Valkyries, through their power alone, give victory or death. This idea is reinforced back in the beguiling of Gylfi, in that here Odin, in disguise, states that while he sends them to every battle, it is the Valkyries themselves who determine who is victor. While we do have one example of a Valkyrie, in this case Brunhilde, being punished for not following Odin's decree to give victory to a particular army, that is only one example among many examples of no such punishment being handed out, or indeed any other examples of Odin having any direct input into who is declared victor. I feel I must also touch on the fact that Snorri also does specify that Skuld, the youngest Norn, is listed among the Valkyries, which is stated in the Poetic Edda as well. This is fascinating to me, because it adds a little weight to the idea that the Valkyries' decisions play a crucial role in deciding what may come to pass of a possible future. Perhaps checks and balances need to be considered, or Skuld in some way needs to be consulted on how deciding one way or another may impact what may happen. It's a pretty common practice to associate the Norns with their Hellenic counterparts and assign them to mean respectively past, present and future. But this isn't accurate, for as I've touched on, fate in the Nordic world is changeable and ever-shifting. The fact that the Valkyries have a decision at all in who is victor on the battlefield speaks volumes here. From our very human perspective, the Valkyries play a crucial intermediary role between the shining heights of Asgard and the mortal realm of Midgard. Saxo Grammaticus, in the third book of his history, describes the Valkyries as a sort of guide, visiting the hero of the story throughout his life. Here, they alter the fortune of war and give blessings. This is a role similar to that fulfilled by the Hellenic goddess Athena and her favoured Odysseus. Perhaps the Valkyries themselves at one point or another were seen more as a champion of heroes. On a final point, the Valkyries are not a monolith. This is important, I think, in helping to tear down the idea of the Valkyries as one unit without personality, which in turn reinforces the notion of them being almost a footnote in the sagas and Eddas. We very rarely get statements such as, the Valkyries are coming, the Valkyries choose among the dead. Rather, they are individually named at almost every single instance, like the gods themselves. Perhaps most intriguing of all are the names of these corpse maidens. At first glance, it is easy to conclude that they embody the chaotic noise and horror of battle. The clashing of shields, spears meeting flesh, arrows raining from above. But there are evident outliers. Air, who we've touched on, means heal, help, or mercy, depending on the interpretation. There's also Rathgritha, meaning potentially council truce or truce. There's Nipt, meaning sister, and Alrune, meaning Aelrune. These names, while admittedly fewer in number than those associated with war and battle, fascinate me, and I go once more to the point that the Valkyries are not a monolith. And I believe some may have had duty or duties outside that of ferrying the souls of the chosen dead. This may offer some justification to the duality of the Valkyrie, outside of the quiet domestication during the heroic sagas, at once serving mead in Valhalla, and To use my favourite description of Hilda, the desiring run of the excessive drying of veins, of apparent maiden and monster. They're so metal. With all of this in mind, I believe that being a Valkyrie was a role one undertook, rather than some sort of permanent classification or race. Perhaps a goddess or being, maybe even a human to account for those mortals apparently chosen in the later sagas, who were particularly skilled at Sather and fate weaving, or otherwise had a bloodlust that made them suited to wading into mortal battlefields, were trained to become Valkyries. While choosing the slain was their core mission, it may be far from their only mission, and they had a role to play in guiding heroes who were particularly weighed down by, for lack of a better turn of phrase, glorious purpose, those that would change many a fate in battle. While it may be true that they were guided and worked alongside Odin, I believe that they were an essential tool for the manipulation of fate and in forging a potential favourable future on a grand scale. In this, they are perhaps better explained, in my opinion, to be a sort of agent of the Nornia, sitting comfortably in that sort of arena. Just as a final piece of brain food, and something I haven't had time to touch on, both the Valkyries and the Nornia have connection to swans. It's a fascinating potential for a rabbit hole or two, connecting to the prevalent theme of animals being realm travellers, animal forms being adopted for travelling across worlds. But I think I've talked long enough. This, after all, is a chapter in my book that I'm writing. Shameless plug. All in all, I strongly believe that the Valkyries lived up to their name as choosers of the slain, and were masters of fate on the battlefield, pulling threads and actively changing the course of battle. They chose who lived and who died on a landscape with vast rippling consequences. So, were the Valkyries mere servants of Odin? I think maybe not.